Welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. So, the Aquaman 2 movie is out, featuring the aquatic superhero going up against his arch enemy, Black Manta. Well, that got me thinking about the comic, and specifically something from the 1970s Aquaman era, a story that was popular enough to get the hero to go from being a backup story in Adventure Comics to getting his own title. It was also written by David Michelinie. Now, Michelinie is a writer who worked on a lot of important stuff for both Marvel and DC. He's the guy who wrote Iron Man's battle with alcoholism, who was writing Spider-Man with the introduction of characters like Venom and Carnage. And to my knowledge, he's the only writer who worked on the marriages of both Superman and Spider-Man. But I will also argue that his run on Aquaman just went too dark for the character. Today, we're going to talk about the time that the Aquaman comics just went too far. In 1973, DC Comics had an apprenticeship program where the chosen apprentices could learn how to become writers. At age 25, Michelinie moved from Kentucky to New York after being hired into the program. And by 1974, he was given assignments writing stories for books like House of Mystery and House of Secrets. By 1975, Michelinie was added to the team writing the Aquaman stories in Adventure Comics, starting with issue 441. We'll come back to this in a moment. I want to address some of the highlights of Michelinie's writing career before looping back to Aquaman. In 1978, he began writing at Marvel and started one of his 2 runs on Iron Man. During that run, he introduced important new characters like James Rhodes, invented the idea of custom armors, and was responsible for writing the memorable Demon in a Bottle story arc, where hero Tony Stark battles alcoholism. Another important run is his lengthy Spider-Man stint on Amazing Spider-Man for over 8 years. During that time, he worked with artists Todd McFarlane, Eric Larson, and Mark Bagley. It's worth noting that sales kept increasing during that time, and I would argue some of that had to be the stability that Michelinie gave the title and the consistency that the characters were written with. This era is best remembered for introducing villains Venom and Carnage. Michelinie wrote that title for nearly 100 issues, from 290 through 388, and is only outpaced for the most Spider-Man issues by Dan Slott and Stan Lee. I grew up on the Michelinie era of Spider-Man, and I look back on it fondly. Maybe that's nostalgia, but I think I've noted a few things that his writing was really known for, and that I think he did well. For instance, there was always a solid structure, and he found a way to have character development within these serialized stories by grounding them with something realistic. For instance, Tony Stark is battling alcoholism. That's a very relatable thing. It was pretty groundbreaking for a mainstream superhero title to have the main character go through something like that. That was definitely new. I think he also has a good sense of humor. And if you read his Spider-Man run, there's some good quips from Spidey himself. By the way, I will strongly recommend his 2 stories in Iron Man where Iron Man goes back in time with Doctor Doom. They're both really fun stories. But if I have a critique of Michelinie's writing, it's that I think he occasionally went too dark for a mainstream superhero title. For instance, I've made an entire episode about how Avengers issue 200 was the worst issue of that title. It involves Carol Danvers discovering she is pregnant somehow, and the accelerated pregnancy leads to the birth of a child who rapidly ages and then mind controls her into falling in love with him, and in turn, he becomes his own father due to time travel shenanigans. The Avengers actually celebrate this, even though Carol is shown to not like the unwanted pregnancy. And the Avengers let their mind-controlled teammate basically be kidnapped. Michelinie was one of the writers of that tale. I think his handling of Tony Stark's problems was handled much more deftly, but it also shows that Michelinie was willing to grow some of these characters up. Unwanted pregnancies and alcoholism were new concepts for these serialized superhero stories. Marvel is probably also grateful for the characters he's co-created for them along the way, like Venom with Todd McFarlane, Carnage with Mark Bagley, the Scott Lang version of Ant-Man with John Byrne, and Taskmaster with George Perez, among others. I'd call most of his books solid adventure stories. The 7-issue Armor Wars is still a highlight from Iron Man's history. The Avengers cover with Hawkeye shooting Ant-Man on an arrow is a classic. But let's get back to Aquaman, which went surprisingly dark. Without recapping every little bit of Aquaman's history, I'll just say that he definitely bounced around a lot from title to title. He started off in More Fun Comics. Eventually, he became the backup feature in books like Adventure Comics and then Detective Comics. Every once in a while, he had his own solo title for a little while, but he rarely had long runs by creative teams. He had a lot of short stints by different creative teams. There was a lot of turnover with Aquaman. Therefore, DC Editorial was more than willing to take some chances with the character, and that is exactly what writer David Michelinie and artist Jim Aparo did. Leading up to their run, it's worth noting that Aquaman married Mera in 1964's issue 18 of Aquaman. That was the first superhero wedding. In 1965's Aquaman issue 23, they had a baby. Other important elements include his sidekick Aqualad joining the title, who had been introduced in 1960, and his archenemy Black Manta, introduced in 1967's Aquaman issue 35. Black Manta was only known to be a human being who had mysterious motivations to conquer the seas, and was always equipped with a distinctive helmet. Michelinie's story arc features an epic battle with Black Manta, which starts in issue 452 of Adventure Comics. The previous issue featured Aquaman's pet octopus Topo mysteriously abducting Aquaman's baby. On his way to get his son back, some Atlanteans from a pacifist sect alert Aquaman that their leader, Aqualad, has also been abducted. Issue 452, titled Dark Destiny, Deadly Dreams, is a 17-page story that kicks off with a dynamic splash page featuring Aquaman battling some scuba diving assailants. After battling them for a while, Aquaman remembers to summon some fish to help him out, and he has these scuba divers knocked out. The pacifist Atlanteans explain that these were the same soldiers that kidnapped Aqualad and conquered their city. Aquaman follows the idealists to their city, but he's knocked out from behind by a hammerhead shark. When he wakes up, Aquaman finds himself chained up in a prison with Aqualad. Soon enough, the leader of the scuba diver mercenaries shows up and reveals himself as Black Manta. He explains he plans to give his people this city as a new place for them to live, and takes off his helmet for the first time. He's a black man, and he says that's why he called himself Black Manta, and his goal is to give black men a new undersea home, free from prejudice. But of course, he's taking it violently, so we can't really get behind him. Aquaman manages to escape, but he realizes he's unable to control the fish in the ocean and gives up using his telepathic powers. Aquaman soon comes across his son and Topo imprisoned, and gives up so that they are not harmed. Black Manta then forces Aquaman and Aqualad to battle one another to the death in a gladiatorial match. Aquaman tells Aqualad it's not his fault, and also reasons out that he thinks Topo took his infant son to make Aquaman follow him and hopefully rescue Aqualad. Black Manta explains that they have a time limit for this fight because, as the heroes fight, he will fill Aquababy's prison bubble with air, eventually suffocating him. The fight is fierce, but Aquaman realizes that the fish in the area are actually mechanical, created by Black Manta with his engineering genius. Realizing that he does still have his telepathic control of sea creatures, Aquaman controls Topo, who breaks out of his cell and crushes Black Manta's controls for his electronic fish. Aquaman hurls his trident to break his son's bubble, but Black Manta is able to blast away at the Colosseum to delay Aquaman's pursuit. The issue ends on a surprise, as it turns out Aquaman was not fast enough, and his son has suffocated. This is a stunningly dark story for Aquaman, a character who I think is known best for having some pretty goofy Silver Age stories in the years leading up to this. You know, for instance, going to college and helping out a local swim team. I think that having his son kidnapped is one thing, but to kill him off, I think is just too dark. The following issues deal with the fallout, things like him arresting Black Manta and Mera leaving Aquaman because she blames him for the death of their son. It's surprisingly bleak. Tragedy is a necessary component to having a hero overcome adversity. It's baked into many superheroes' origin stories. The death of their parents is a common trope that motivates them to fight crime, from Batman to Spider-Man. But tone is important. Aquaman in the 1970s is not the same as, say, Watchmen in the mid-80s, which imagines what a world would be like with actual superheroes in it. You could certainly argue that moments like the death of Aquababy paved a path where stories subverting the common tropes was more accepted. But I would also argue that killing off a baby was really not worth what the character got out of it. Aquaman got his solo title back, but it only lasted from issues 57 through 63. It made Aquaman into less of a tragic character and more of a depressing one, as he lost everyone around him. In fact, he only had 38 more stories after this, bouncing around titles like Adventure Comics and World's Finest, until Crisis on Infinite Earths rebooted DC continuity in 1986, giving the character a fresh start. I don't blame David Michelinie for swinging for the fences and doing something new and big with the character. But I do think that at this point, DC Editorial should have stepped in, because here's what happened. Michelinie wrote the story, and then he was only around for a few more issues. So there wasn't a lot of follow-up to pay off this big story moment. Aquaman did not get a big bump in popularity from this story. I think you need some consistency and some payoff if you're going to do something this big. Instead, I think that this is one of the saddest superhero stories around, and unfortunately, one that just did not get a big payoff. Thanks so much for joining me. I'll be back next week with my top 10 list of 2023. It's been an interesting year. It's a lot of hard work to narrow down my top comics for this past year. But that's what we're doing next week. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you real soon. And until then, keep reading comics. Hey folks, just enjoying a coffee in a nice paper cup. And as you can probably tell by the slightly different haircut, it's been a minute since I recorded and started editing this episode, and in that time I've gone to see the Aquaman movie. I thought I'd just give you some spoiler-free thoughts on that. Now I've got energy. Just real quick, I would say I think it's honestly slightly better than the first Aquaman movie, but tonally and performance-wise and visually, it's very similar. So your enjoyment of the movie is going to depend on what you thought of the first one. You probably don't need to have seen the first one if you're curious about this sequel. Does it adapt anything from the comics? Not directly in terms of a story. It takes characters, of course, from the comics, including some concepts, vehicles, locations. But that's some pretty deep dive stuff in a way. I would say it was pretty enjoyable. It's the last movie of that DC expanded universe. The best of the 4 DC movies that we got this year, although I will say that I kind of liked Blue Beetle. I thought that that one was pretty enjoyable. Maybe that can sort of help you base where I'm coming from for this mini review. I'd probably give it somewhere around a C+. Around a C+, maybe. Very digital, very animated, but you know what? Tonally, that kind of works for Aquaman, being underwater with all sorts of weird monsters and creatures. Patrick Wilson as his half-brother Orm kind of steals the movie, to be honest. pretty entertaining there. But does it directly adapt a comic? No. Curious if you've seen it to hear your thoughts in the replies below, and I will see you in 2024. Take care.